The whispers began the moment she stepped into the ballroom. Lady Elara Whitmore, daughter of a fallen baronet, stood beneath the chandeliers, her gown plain amidst a sea of silk and jewels. Laughter rippled, soft but cruel, as fans fluttered to hide smirks. She curtsied, trembling yet proud, her modest muslin dress the emblem of her disgrace. The Duke of Ashbourne, cold and untouchable, watched from across the marble floor. To the ton, he was perfection incarnate. To her, a symbol of the world that mocked her. But when scandal struck and truth unraveled, it was that same Duke who would kneel before her, whispering words that silenced every cruel tongue. "Forgive me, my true Duchess." The chandeliers of Everley Hall burned like captured constellations, their light falling in soft golden layers upon gowns of silk and brocade. Laughter rippled through the crowd like the rustle of taffeta, and the perfume of roses mingled with the faint chill of a late London evening drifting through open doors. The Marchioness's annual ball had drawn every titled name of consequence, and every eye glittered with the practiced art of curiosity. Lady Elara Whitmore paused at the top of the staircase, her gloved hands trembling against her small ivory fan. Her gown, pale blue muslin trimmed with faded lace, was a relic of gentler times, once worn by her mother when fortune had still smiled upon the Whitmore name. Now, among gowns heavy with gemstones and feathers, it seemed a ghost. Still, she lifted her chin, her bearing calm and deliberate. "Is that Miss Whitmore?" someone whispered below. The baronet's daughter, ruined by debt. "She should have stayed in the country," the remarks floated upward, light and cruel as bubbles. Elara heard them, felt each one bruise the tender places in her pride, but her face remained serene. She descended the stairs as though the whispers were wind, nothing more. At the bottom, her aunt, the kindly but timid Mrs. Alden, received her with a nervous smile. "There you are, my dear. You look, well, quite charming." The word sat uneasily between comfort and apology. Elara's gaze swept the room, the glittering mirrors, the marble columns, the orchestra preparing a new waltz. Everywhere she turned, she saw the easy luxury that once would have been hers by birthright, before her father's misjudged investments and sudden death left her with only a modest dowry and a tarnished name. She had not wished to attend this ball, but her aunt had insisted, whispering that perhaps fortune could still favor a virtuous girl if she only appeared brave enough to be seen. The waltz began. Couples circled the floor, silks blooming like flowers under candlelight. Elara stood quietly near the edge, pretending fascination with the orchestra. "Lady Elara, is it?" drawled a voice behind her. She turned to find Lord Wilton, a man of wealth but no warmth. His gaze travelled the length of her gown. "A touch old-fashioned, but respectable." "Respectability is the only luxury I can still afford, my lord," she replied, her tone measured. His smile faltered, but before he could recover, the room stirred. The music seemed to swell, as if in recognition of an arrival. All heads turned. The Duke of Ashbourne had entered. Tall, composed, his dark attire gleaming subtly with understated finery, he walked as one accustomed to command. It was said he could silence a room merely by looking at it, and so he did now. Conversation dimmed, fans paused mid-wave. The orchestra, recovering its rhythm, softened the tempo into something slower, more deliberate. Elara had heard the tales, that he sought a duchess for alliance, not affection, that he was unyielding, even proud to a fault. But seeing him in person was disarming. There was nothing cruel in his eyes, only distance, the kind that makes one ache to be seen. Their gazes met. Only a moment, but the room seemed to still around her. He approached. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice deep yet composed, "would you honor me with this dance?" A collective gasp fluttered through the assembly. A plain, debt-shadowed baronet's daughter, and the Duke of Ashbourne. The Marchioness's fan stilled mid-air. Even Lord Wilton's smirk dissolved. Elara's heart stuttered. "Your Grace," she managed, "I fear I shall not match the grace of your usual partners." "Then I am in need of humbling," he replied softly. Offering his hand, she placed her gloved fingers upon his, light as breath. Together they stepped onto the floor. The waltz began anew. The Duke's hand at her waist was steady, formal, yet somehow protective. The music carried them in smooth, unhurried circles. Elara's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from the strange warmth of being truly regarded. Around them whispers faltered, replaced by astonished silence. "You dance well," he said quietly. "My mother insisted it was a survival skill, a wise woman, something like amusement, rare, fleeting," touched his lips. For a moment she allowed herself to imagine that the evening could end without humiliation, that perhaps grace could outweigh gossip. But fortune, fickle as ever, had other designs. As the final notes of the waltz lingered in the air, a sudden tug at her skirts made her freeze. A harsh tearing sound followed, the unmistakable rip of fabric. Gasps broke around them. Elara looked down. The hem of her gown had caught upon an unseen pin, one placed deliberately, she realized, as mocking laughter bubbled nearby. A cluster of young women, their jewels glittering like malice, hid smirks behind their fans. "Oh dear," one murmured sweetly, "a tragedy of threadbare lace." The Duke's hand fell away. His face, once composed, hardened into unreadable indifference. For an instant she thought he might defend her. Instead, he bowed curtly and stepped back. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his tone distant now, "you have my gratitude for the dance." Gratitude. A dismissal cloaked in courtesy. The laughter swelled. The orchestra hesitated, then began again, as though nothing had happened. Elara felt her cheeks flame, yet she refused to let tears claim her. She gathered the torn edge of her gown, straightened her posture, and curtsied. "Your Grace," she said softly. "The honor was mine." Then she turned and walked away, each step deliberate despite the weight pressing behind her ribs. As she reached the outer hall, the sound of the music returned to a distant echo, fading behind marble columns and gilded doors. The night air struck cool against her flushed cheeks. She paused beneath a lantern, drawing a slow, trembling breath. "Not broken," she whispered to herself. "Never broken," a footman approached with her cloak. She accepted it wordlessly, fastening it at her throat. Behind her, laughter drifted faintly from the ballroom, a cruel melody she would not carry home. Outside, the sky had softened to mist. Carriages waited in neat rows, their lamps glowing faintly in the fog. Elara stepped down the stone steps, her slipper catching slightly on the torn hem. She stopped and looked back once more at the mansion, the windows blazing with opulence, a world that seemed farther away than ever. Somewhere inside, the Duke of Ashbourne was likely dancing again, his gaze indifferent, his conscience untouched. And yet, she had seen a flicker in him, a hesitation, brief but real, before he turned away. It was not pride that wounded her most, but the possibility that he, too, might have felt something he could not name. A carriage door closed nearby. Her aunt's anxious voice called, "Elara, my dear, come quickly. You are pale." "I am merely enlightened," she murmured, stepping inside. As the carriage wheels began to roll through the fog, she pressed her hand to the window pane, watching Everley Hall recede into a blur of gold and shadow. Tonight had broken the fragile illusion of belonging, but somewhere beneath humiliation, something else stirred. A quiet, defiant dignity, and in the depths of her heart, one question lingered. Soft as the fading waltz, would the Duke remember the woman the Tun tried to forget? Morning light drifted through the lace curtains of Mrs. Alden's townhouse, pale and uncertain, as though reluctant to intrude upon sorrow. The ballroom of last night still haunted Elara's mind. The laughter, the torn hem, the Duke's cool dismissal replaying like a cruel refrain. She sat at her small writing desk, the ink on her fingers smudged from a half-finished letter of thanks to her hostess. The paper trembled faintly beneath her hand, for she could not bring herself to sign it. Gratitude was a luxury she could not yet afford. A knock interrupted her thoughts. The maid entered, curtsying shyly. "A letter for you, miss. Brought by a footman, said it's urgent." Elara turned, surprise flickering. "A letter for me?" The maid nodded, holding out a thick ivory envelope embossed with a familiar crest, the Duke of Ashbourne's. The blue wax glistened like midnight. For a heartbeat, The world went still. Elara dismissed the maid and turned the seal over in her hands. The insignia was unmistakable, his family's crest perfectly impressed. Hope, fragile and uninvited, rose like the first breath after drowning. Could it be an apology? A word of kindness to mend what pride had broken? She sat, unfolded the parchment with trembling fingers, and began to read. Miss Whitmore, last night's spectacle was entertaining, though I fear you mistook courtesy for admiration. You danced well enough for a country girl. Let this serve as advice. Ambition ill suits a lady of such limited means. The Tan is merciless, and I would spare you further humiliation were you capable of understanding restraint. Ashbourne. Her pulse stilled. The words blurred, sharp and cruel as daggers drawn with elegance. Elara pressed a hand to her chest, the parchment slipping from her grasp. "No," she whispered, disbelief cracking her composure. He could not write this. But the seal was genuine, the signature unmistakable. Hope collapsed into ashes. She rose abruptly, crossing the room to the fireplace. The embers within glowed faintly, whispering warmth into the still air. Without hesitation, she fed the letter into the flame. The parchment curled, blackened, and dissolved into smoke. "Let pride burn where it belongs," she murmured. Though her voice wavered, Mrs. Alden appeared at the door moments later, her expression soft with concern. "Elara, my dear, you are pale. Has something happened?" "Nothing worth repeating, Aunt," she replied quietly, eyes fixed upon the fire. "Only a lesson. When I shall not forget." Outside the city stirred to life, carriages rattling, bells chiming from St. Martin's. Within, Elara sat in silence, her fingers clasped in her lap, her resolve hardening like steel beneath velvet. She would not seek the Duke's regard again, nor would she bow to the cruel theatre of society. If she was to be mocked, let it be for compassion, not ambition. That same morning, across Grosvenor Square, the Duke of Ashbourne stood by his study window, watching the fog lift from the gardens. His valet entered with the day's correspondence. "Shall I arrange your appointments, Your Grace?" "Later," he said absently. His thoughts had drifted to the ballroom, the quiet dignity of the woman the world had mocked. He recalled the steadiness in her eyes, the grace of her curtsy, the faint tremor in her hand as she gathered her torn gown. He had turned away. He had allowed it. The Duke's jaw tightened. Propriety demanded distance, yet his conscience refused to rest. "Your Grace." He turned, blinking away a thought. "Nothing, Thornton, only—" The night was long. Unaware, he walked toward his desk, where a folded newspaper awaited him. The headline read, "A Duke's Dance and a Lady's Folly, the season's latest entertainment." He scanned the piece, his expression unreadable. The columnist wrote with malicious delight, mocking Elara's dress, her lineage, even the supposed presumption of seeking a duke's hand. The Duke folded the paper, his composure hardening into marble. "Find out who wrote this," he said curtly. "Yes, Your Grace, but the damage was done." Across parlours and tea-tables, the story bloomed like rot disguised as roses. Meanwhile, at a rose-coloured townhouse in Berkeley Square, Lady Rosamond Sinclair reclined on her chaise, a self-satisfied smile playing upon her lips. The faint scent of sealing wax lingered in the air, the same crest stamp resting near her inkwell. "How simple it was," she murmured, admiring her handiwork, the forged letters' remnants folded neatly in her writing drawer. Her maid curtsied nervously. "My lady, what if his Grace discovers—" "Discovers what?" Rosamond's tone dripped with silk. "That a foolish girl mistook ridicule for romance? The Duke would thank me. Men of his stature need protection from such pretensions." She rose, crossing to the mirror. Her reflection met her with flawless satisfaction. Golden hair, arranged to perfection, pearls gleaming at her throat. "He will see reason soon enough," she whispered. "And when he does, he shall see me." Days passed. The whispers grew. Elara's name became shorthand for misplaced ambition. At the milliner's shop, women giggled behind ribbons. At the tea-rooms, her name was uttered only between smirks. She heard it all, and yet she endured. In place of morning calls and invitations, she devoted her hours to the narrow streets of Covent Garden. There, among soot-streaked children and weary mothers, her humiliation seemed irrelevant. She helped distribute bread, mended garments, and taught hymns to orphans whose laughter, though thin, was honest. "Miss Elara," said little Agnes one dawn, tugging her sleeve, "you smile different from the fine ladies." "Like you mean it," Elara knelt, adjusting the child's scarf. "Smiles that are earned, dear one, are better than those that are bought." The sun crept above the rooftops, pale and patient. The air smelled of fresh bread and coal smoke. For the first time in days, Elara felt a measure of peace, a fragile one, but real. Still, at night, when she unpinned her hair and sat before the mirror, she could not help but wonder. Had the Duke truly written those cruel words? Or had her heart invented excuses to soften truth? She shook the thought away. "No matter," she whispered. "I am done with dreams." Weeks later at his club, the Duke overheard two gentlemen laughing over a rumor. "Did you read about Miss Whitmore?" One said, "Apparently she has found her true calling, charity work. Feeding orphans instead of chasing dukes," the other snickered. "How noble of her." The Duke's hand stilled on his glass. "Enough," he said quietly, his tone carrying command even through civility. The laughter died. When they turned, they found him watching with cool detachment. "Gentlemen, there is little amusement in cruelty. A man's worth is not measured by the size of his mockery." With that he rose and left. Outside, the night air bit sharply. He stood beneath the gaslight, recalling the last look in Elara's eyes, the quiet dignity of a woman wronged yet unbowed. "Miss Whitmore," he murmured to the dark, "you deserved better than laughter." And though he could not know it yet, his words would soon find echo in the most unexpected of places. For by dawn, a footman would bring him word from Covent Garden. The lady they mock feeds orphans at dawn. The Duke turned from the window, the first crack of remorse widening within him. The lamps outside the Royal Opera House burned low and golden, their light spilling across the carriages that arrived one after another in stately procession. The evening air shimmered faintly with the perfume of London's elite, the mingling of rosewater, powder, and ambition. Inside, chandeliers trembled with brilliance, their crystal prisms scattering light upon silks and jewels like fractured rainbows. Elara Whitmore had not intended to attend. Her aunt, Mrs. Alden, had insisted that art would restore her spirit. "You have been too long in solitude, my dear," she had said that morning. "The world must see that grace is not defined by gossip." And so Elara found herself beneath the painted dome of the opera house, seated in a modest lower box. Her gown was simple ivory satin, unadorned save for a pale lavender ribbon at the waist. The fabric caught the candlelight softly, elegance without ostentation. Around her the tiers bloomed with finery, diamonds glittering like frost, fans fluttering in choreographed rhythm, laughter rising and falling like notes in a careless symphony. When the orchestra began its overture, Elara's heart steadied. The first swell of violins seemed to cleanse the air of whispers. For a time she forgot herself, the humiliation, the letter, the endless murmurs of Miss Whitmore said with pitying smiles. Music, she thought, was the one place where one could stand beside angels and not be measured. Unseen from her box above, the Duke of Ashbourne entered moments later. He had not wished to attend either. His sister, Lady Catherine, had demanded it, calling his recent silence melancholic and unbecoming of his rank. "London will think you pining," she teased, "and I shan't bear the scandal." He smiled faintly, though the jest struck too near the truth. From the shadows of his upper box, his gaze swept across the tiers and found her Elara. He did not expect the quiet ache that followed. She looked unchanged and yet transformed, graceful still, but there was a serenity in her now, an inner composure no ridicule could tarnish. She was listening intently to the music, unaware of being observed, her profile illuminated by the golden glow of the footlights. The Duke leaned forward slightly, his gloved hand tightening around the railing. Propriety forbade him from seeking her out. Guilt demanded that he must. Below, the opera unfolded, a tragic love between a soldier and a seamstress, doomed by pride and class. It was too near the truth, too sharp a mirror. At intermission, the grand foyer came alive with conversation. Fans waved faster. Champagne glittered in slender glasses. Elara accompanied her aunt to the refreshment table, content to remain at the edge of the crowd. She had learned that invisibility, properly wielded, was a kind of armor. Not far away, Lady Rosamond Sinclair basked in admiration. Her gown, a daring crimson, sparkled beneath the chandeliers, though the jewels could not mask the sharpness in her smile. When she saw Elara, her expression soured like spoiled cream. "My, how charitable of you to grace us with your simplicity," she said sweetly. "Do tell me, has muslin become the height of fashion among the benevolent?" Elara inclined her head. "It is favored by those who prefer comfort over cruelty." Before Rosamond could respond, a careless elbow sent a glass of champagne tumbling, spilling golden liquid down the front of her gown. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. "Oh, heavens!" exclaimed Mrs. Alden, reaching for her handkerchief, but Elara was quicker. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and offered her own, embroidered linen, plain but spotless. "Here, my lady," she said gently. "Press the stain before it sets." Rosamond stared at the handkerchief as though it were poison. "How touching," she said, her voice sharp enough to slice glass. "The charity girl offers pity now. Keep it. I should not wish to share your virtue." Laughter stirred among the surrounding ladies. Elara's cheeks warmed, yet her gaze remained steady. "As you wish, Lady Rosamond," she said quietly, tucking the handkerchief back into her reticule. "Some stains, it seems, cannot be removed." For a heartbeat, silence hung between them. Then the crowd's laughter turned away from Elara, directed instead toward Rosamond's ruined gown. Above, in the shadows of his box, the Duke had witnessed everything. His jaw tightened, not from anger toward Rosamond alone, but from his own shame. He had been silent once before. He would not be again. When the lights dimmed for the second act, a small envelope arrived at Elara's box, delivered by a discreet usher. She looked down at it, confusion knitting her brow. The seal bore a familiar crest, the Duke's. Her aunt arched a brow. "You are acquainted with his grace?" "I was," Elara murmured, unsealing it. Inside, a single line written in a firm hand. "You deserve an apology." She read it twice, her breath catching. Across the theatre her eyes found him. The Duke sat upright, composed, yet his gaze held a quiet urgency. Their eyes locked across the tiers, the orchestra swelling between them. For one fleeting heartbeat, the glittering crowd vanished. There was only her and him, the echo of violins, and the fragile thread of what might have been. The spell shattered when Lady Catherine's voice carried from the Duke's box. Too loud, too sharp. "Truly, brother," she said to those beside her, "London is absurd. A lady of no fortune, no title, and yet they say she feeds orphans at dawn. Next she shall be feeding upon our sympathy." A ripple of laughter followed. The words reached Elara like a chill draught through silk. Her spine stiffened. Slowly she rose. "Come, aunt," she said softly. "We have seen enough tragedy for one night." Mrs. Alden hesitated, seeing the Duke's gaze fixed upon them. "Elara, should you not?" "No," Elara replied, her tone even but brittle. "Let him keep his apology. It costs nothing to write what pride forbids him to speak." As she turned to leave, her eyes met his once more. This time, there was no pretense of composure in his expression, only the unmistakable shadow of regret. Outside, the night had turned misty. Carriages lined the curb, lamps glimmering like stars trapped in glass. Elara's coachman hurried to open the door as she stepped into the damp air. The faint echo of applause drifted from within the opera house, applause she could no longer hear without pain. As her carriage began to roll away, the Duke emerged from a side entrance, cloak gathered at his shoulders. His sister called after him, but he ignored her. Through the fog, he glimpsed the retreating carriage lamps ahead, swaying gently like distant beacons. He followed at a careful distance, his own driver maintaining the silence he did not break. When her carriage turned down the narrow lane leading toward her aunt's modest townhouse, the Duke leaned forward. "Do not approach," he ordered softly. "Only stop here." He watched as Elara stepped out beneath the lamplight, her cloak drawn close, her figure small yet resolute against the greyness of London night. She paused once, looking toward the empty street, as if sensing unseen eyes. The Duke's hand gripped the edge of the window frame. He longed to call her name, to offer explanation, reparation, anything, but the weight of propriety, of his own past cowardice, held him fast. When she vanished inside, the lamplight flickering behind the door, he spoke at last, only to himself. "Forgive me for what I did not defend." The mist thickened, curling around his carriage like unspoken truth. Somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the hour, solemn, final. Yet within him something fragile began to shift, the first fissure in the armor of his pride. London's sky that evening hung low and bruised, a canopy of slate clouds trembling with withheld rain. By the time Elara's carriage turned onto Grosvenor Square, the heavens had surrendered. The storm broke with a force that blurred lamps and cobblestones into shimmering pools of light. The downpour was relentless, washing the city clean of pretense, or so it seemed. Inside her modest coach, Elara pressed her gloved hand against the rattling windowpane, watching rivulets trace crooked paths down the glass. Her aunt had insisted she take the carriage rather than walk from Covent Garden, where she had spent the day overseeing supplies for the orphanage. But the horse's uneven gait told her something was wrong. Moments later, the coach lurched violently, then halted altogether. The driver's voice called out, muffled by the rain. "Beg pardon, miss, the wheels caught fast." Elara sighed, drawing her cloak closer. "We shall wait until it can be freed." But even as she spoke, the rain grew heavier, thunder rolling low like a warning. She reached for the door, meaning to speak to the driver, then froze at the sound of approaching hooves. A second carriage drew up beside hers, its lamps cutting through the storm. From within, a familiar voice called, deep and steady despite the wind. "Miss Whitmore." Her breath caught. The door opened, revealing the Duke of Ashbourne, rain glistening in his dark hair, his greatcoat unfastened, his expression unreadable. The storm had softened his severity. He looked less like a figure of judgment, more like a man haunted by what he could not undo. "Your carriage appears in distress," he said, his tone restrained but urgent. "You cannot remain here. Please, take shelter in mine." Elara hesitated, her pride rising even as cold rain seeped through the seams of her gloves. "Your Grace, I assure you it is unnecessary. My driver will have it mended shortly." The Duke stepped closer, rain darkening his shoulders. "Forgive me, but I cannot in good conscience leave you to weather this alone. I insist." There was something in his voice, an undertone of contrition, quiet and unwavering. Against her better judgment, she allowed him to guide her to his carriage. The door closed behind them with a muffled thud, sealing them in warmth and shadow. Inside, a single candle flickered within a glass lamp, its golden light drawing gentle outlines upon velvet and polished wood. Outside, rain drummed steadily on the roof, a percussive rhythm that filled the silence between them. Elara sat opposite him, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. Water clung to the hem of her cloak. A few loose strands of hair had fallen across her cheek. The Duke watched her for a long moment before speaking. "Miss Whitmore, I owe you words I should have spoken months ago." She did not lift her gaze. "Words are easily offered, Your Grace. I have received them before, some even sealed with your name." His breath caught, a quiet, involuntary sound. "Then you know of it, the letter." "I know enough." He leaned forward, his voice low. "Then allow me to say this plainly. That letter was not mine. Its cruelty bore my crest but not my hand. I swear it on my honor." Elara's eyes flickered upward, searching his face. "Do men of your rank still speak of honor?" His answer came without hesitation. "When they lose it, they must." A silence followed, deep and fragile. The candle's flame trembled as the rain intensified, casting their shadows against the walls like confessions caught in motion. At last she spoke, her voice softer. "Why tell me this now?" "Because I have lived these weeks with your silence as punishment enough," he said quietly. I have seen what gossip has made of you, and I have been cowardly in my restraint. I sought to protect my name when I should have defended yours." Elara's composure faltered. The sincerity in his tone was disarming, his remorse unpolished, real. Still, she steadied herself. "You could have denied the rumor then. You chose not to." "I chose silence because I feared scandal," he admitted. "And yet, it seems my silence was scandal itself." The words lingered. Rain pounded harder against the glass, as though echoing the confession. She turned her gaze to the window, where droplets slid down in crooked lines, merging, separating, like choices undone. "And what is it you wish from me now, Your Grace? Forgiveness? Or permission to forget?" He studied her, the faintest tremor in his voice. "Neither. Only that you should know the truth before my pride denies me the chance again." Her breath trembled, her heart caught between indignation and something perilously close to mercy. "Truth," she whispered, "is not easily believed from those who deliver it so late." The Duke's gaze softened. "Then allow my deeds to prove what my words cannot." Outside, the driver's voice called faintly through the storm, but neither of them moved. The air between them was taut, charged not with passion, but with the fragile tension of unspoken history. For a moment, Elara's eyes met his fully, the first time since the night of the ball. There was sorrow in his expression, yes, but also an earnestness that no artifice could feign. She looked away first, her gloved hand tightening around her cloak. "You think remorse erases the harm it wrought?" "No," he said quietly. "But I pray redemption begins where pride ends." Something in her faltered then, something long held and brittle. She wanted to believe him, if only to quiet the ache of disappointment that had shadowed her every step since that night. But before she could answer, a voice pierced the storm outside. "Ashbourne!" Both heads turned. Through the rain-streaked window, a figure appeared, Lady Rosamond, her bonnet askew, her voice rising above the wind. "Ashbourne, there you are. Whatever are you doing out here?" Elara froze. The colour drained from her face. The world, once private and fragile, collapsed into the harshness of public perception. The Duke reached for the door. "Rosamond, this is not—" But Elara stood first, her composure regained in an instant. "Say no more, Your Grace. The tongue will have its whispers before dawn, but they shall not begin with me." He rose as well, rainlight catching the anguish in his eyes. "Miss Whitmore, please." She curtsied, the gesture deliberate, distant. "You have said enough tonight. May your conscience find the peace your reputation demands." Before he could reply, she opened the door, stepping out into the rain. The downpour swallowed her immediately, cloak and hair darkened to shadow. He called her name once, but the wind carried it away. Through the fogged window, he watched her carriage finally lurch forward, wheels freed, lamps flickering as it disappeared down the lane. The Duke sank back into his seat, the candlelight guttering beside him. The scent of her, lavender and rain, still lingered faintly in the air. He pressed his hand to his forehead, eyes closing. "Redemption," he whispered, "is never spoken, it must be earned." Outside, thunder rolled again, distant but echoing, as though the heavens themselves had taken witness. The chandeliers of Wexford Hall burned like captured suns, their crystal teardrops scattering 1,000 shards of gold across marble floors and brocade gowns. The Marquis of Wexford's annual ball was the pinnacle of the season, where alliances were forged, reputations built, and sometimes quietly destroyed. Elara Whitmore had come only to accompany her cousin, Clara Alden, who clutched her arm with nervous excitement as they entered the glittering ballroom. "You look lovely." "Elara," Clara whispered, adjusting the satin ribbon at her cousin's waist. "Perhaps tonight you will dance again." Elara smiled faintly. "I have danced enough for a lifetime, my dear. Tonight I am merely a chaperone." Her gown was pale grey silk, modest yet elegant, its simplicity standing in delicate contrast to the jewelled extravagance around her. The candlelight lent her complexion a quiet luminescence. Though she sought invisibility, she carried a presence that could not be erased, but not all eyes were kind. From the far end of the hall, Lady Rosamond Sinclair observed her like a hawk circling prey. The soft fan in her hand fluttered idly, concealing a smile that did not reach her eyes. The Duke of Ashbourne was also present that evening, tall and grave in black and silver. He stood near the marquis, exchanging restrained pleasantries, though his gaze, when unguarded, drifted more than once toward the woman he had wronged. Elara noticed and quickly looked away. The orchestra struck the opening notes of a waltz, the music unfolding like silk over the polished floor. Couples swept into motion. The air shimmered with perfume, laughter, and that peculiar brand of cruelty disguised as charm. Elara stood quietly at the edge of the dance floor, her hands clasped before her, observing the scene with distant composure. She did not notice Rosamond approaching until the lady's perfume, sharp, sweet, and suffocating, announced her presence. "My dear Miss Whitmore," Rosamond said, her smile gleaming with artifice. "I did not expect to see you here. Surely the season's amusements must seem trivial compared to your charitable pursuits." Elara inclined her head. "Kindness and conversation need not be mutually exclusive, my lady." Rosamond's lips twitched. "Indeed, speaking of conversation, your name has been upon many tongues of late." "I am aware," Elara said quietly. "Then you shall not be surprised when it finds its way upon mine." With a theatrical flourish, Rosamond drew from her reticule a folded piece of parchment, cream-coloured, sealed once with blue wax. "It appears," she said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "that Miss Whitmore's devotion to his Grace of Ashbourne extended far beyond a mere waltz." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The music faltered, Elara's face drained of colour. "What is this?" Rosamond's eyes gleamed. "A letter addressed to his Grace, in which you profess your love and ambition, even offering yourself as his consolation." A murmur rose through the guests. Fans stilled mid-air. Every glance became a dagger. "That is false," Elara said, her voice trembling only slightly. "I wrote no such letter." Rosamond smiled as if pitying her. "Denying one's handwriting, how tragic. Would you have us believe this was composed by a phantom?" The Duke had turned at the commotion. The crowd parted before him like the tide. He approached with deliberate calm, his expression unreadable, his presence commanding. "Lady Rosamond," he said, his tone like steel beneath silk, "may I see this letter?" Rosamond hesitated, caught off guard by the cold precision in his voice. "Why, of course, Your Grace. I had no wish to offend, only to warn you of unseemly intentions." He took the letter, unfolding it with measured grace. The parchment crackled faintly in the hush. His eyes moved swiftly over the words, then stopped. The silence deepened. At last he looked up, his expression darkened by restrained fury. "A forgery," he said simply. A ripple of disbelief passed through the onlookers. He turned the paper over, revealing a faint indentation where the seal had been impressed. Not his, but a counterfeit. "The signature is clumsy, the phrasing coarse. Miss Whitmore's name has been abused by a hand unworthy of ink." Rosamond's composure faltered. I received it anonymously." "Indeed." His voice dropped, low and dangerous. "Then you have been both deceived and deceiver. Allow me to correct both." He turned toward the assembled guests. "Miss Whitmore's honor is unblemished. The only dishonor here lies in deceit, not in dignity." The crowd stirred, some ashamed, others delighted by the spectacle of moral retribution. Rosamond's painted lips parted, but no sound came. Elara stood frozen, the colour returning slowly to her cheeks. She met the Duke's gaze, her eyes luminous with gratitude and disbelief. But behind it lingered something deeper, a sorrow that his defence had come only after ruin had been tasted. The orchestra, uncertain, began again. Conversation resumed in cautious fragments. Yet for Elara, the room felt suffocating, its gold and glass pressing close like a cage. She curtsied, murmuring to her cousin, "Pray excuse me, Clara." Then she fled through the side doors, out into the cool night air. The gardens behind Wexford Hall were quiet, the air fragrant with late-blooming roses. Rain from earlier that afternoon clung to petals and leaves, silvered by moonlight. Elara walked quickly down the path, the soft gravel crunching under her slippers, her breath trembling. At last, she reached a marble fountain and stopped. The dam of composure broke. She pressed her hand to her mouth, the first sob escaping against her will. The humiliation, the pitying stares, the whispers. She had endured too much. Even the Duke's gallant words could not erase the sting of being publicly dragged through shame once more. Behind her, footsteps approached. Miss Whitmore, she turned sharply, hastily brushing tears from her cheeks. The Duke stood a few paces away, his face half lit by the lantern he carried. "Your Grace," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling. "I thank you for your defense, but you should not have followed me. The scandal grows with every breath we share." He took another step forward. "Let them whisper. I owe you more than silence could ever atone for." Elara shook her head. "No, Your Grace, what you owe is truth, to yourself, to your conscience. But pity me not. I have endured enough of that from your world." He looked stricken. "It is not pity I feel. Then what is it?" she asked softly. He hesitated, words forming and dying upon his tongue. At last he bowed his head. "Something I have not yet the right to name." Her eyes softened, though her tone remained firm. "Then earn that right, not through titles or defense, but through deeds that no witness need applaud." She curtsied, a gesture not of submission, but of farewell. "Good night, Your Grace. Allow me to find my peace before you offer your regret." The Duke stood motionless as she turned away, her silhouette dissolving among the pale blossoms. The garden seemed to breathe with her absence, the roses trembling in the faint wind. He lowered his gaze, the lantern light casting shadows across his face. For the first time, he bowed, not to a lady nor to expectation, but to the truth he had long denied. "Then so be it," he murmured. "I will earn it." Above, the night sky shimmered faintly, as though the stars themselves had overheard a vow. The scandal at Wexford Hall had rippled through London, like perfume spilled across silk, sweet to some, cloying to others, impossible to contain. Yet as weeks passed, the fragrance began to change. Pity replaced mockery. Indignation softened into uneasy admiration. The tongue, ever fickle, now spoke of Miss Whitmore in contradictory tones. "She bore it with grace," murmured one lady at a luncheon. "Grace born of cunning," another countered, fanning herself briskly. And through it all, Elara walked untouched by their speculation, her composure the quiet rebellion that neither rumour nor rank could shatter. But in the halls of Ashbourne House, the storm had taken a different form. The Duke sat before the tall windows of his library, rain streaking the glass in mournful lines. Across from him, his mother, the Dowager Duchess, stood in silken disapproval, an image of restrained authority, her pearls gleaming like frost at her throat. "You mean to tell me," she said, her tone clipped, "that you have written no denial, no statement, nothing to dispel this absurd association?" He met her gaze calmly. "I have not, Marcus," she said, her voice sharpening. "The late Duke, your father, entrusted you with our name, our fortune, our alliances. You would cast all that aside for a woman whose lineage is in tatters." Ashbourne rose, his figure framed against the grey light. "A title without honour, mother, is poverty itself." Her eyes flashed. "Do not mistake sentiment for virtue. The world does not forgive scandal, it feeds upon it." He turned away, hands clasped behind his back. "Then let the world starve." A silence fell. Only the ticking of the mantel clock marked the space between them. At last she spoke, her tone softening, though her pride did not. "You are your father's son indeed, stubborn in conscience, blind in affection. Pray it does not ruin you." He inclined his head respectfully, though his voice held quiet steel. "If ruin is the price of decency, I shall pay it willingly." The Dowager's eyes glistened, not with tears, but with the sharp glint of reluctant admiration. "You sound precisely as he once did, before the world taught him prudence." He smiled faintly. "Then I am late to my education." When she left the room, the Duke exhaled deeply, leaning a hand against the window-pane. Rain streaked beneath his fingers like veins of silver. In his reflection, he saw not the image of nobility, but the shadow of a man stripped of illusions. He thought of Elara, her eyes, her defiance, the tremor in her voice when she had said, "Allow me to find my peace before you offer your pity." He had bowed then, not from guilt, but from something deeper, something frighteningly close to reverence. Across London, in a small townhouse near Bloomsbury, Elara awoke to a morning bright, with hesitant sunlight. It filtered through sheer curtains, dancing on the worn mahogany of her writing desk. She had taken to teaching piano lessons to supplement her aunt's modest means, her pupils ranging from shy governesses to earnest tradesmen's daughters, each note struck beneath her. Fingers felt like a reclamation of self, a reminder that beauty could exist, apart from approval. That morning, as she finished her tea, the post arrived. A single letter lay atop the pile, its envelope heavy, the seal unmarked by family crest. She hesitated before opening it. The script was unfamiliar, refined, deliberate. "Madame, the trustees of St. Brigid's Orphan School humbly invite you to instruct music to our wards. Your reputation for kindness precedes you. All expenses have been provided for by an anonymous patron who holds your character in high esteem. Should you accept, the post is yours at once." Elara reread the letter twice, her heart stirring with disbelief and cautious joy. Teaching had long been her secret wish, to give children the solace she had once sought in melody. "Anonymous," she whispered. "Who could—" The thought struck before she could dismiss it. The Duke. Her breath caught. She folded the letter quickly, as though by hiding it she could deny the warmth rising within her. By noon, she visited St. Brigid's. The orphanage stood near Covent Garden, modest but bright, its whitewashed walls gleaming against the grey cobbles. Inside, laughter echoed, soft, untamed, pure. Sister Margaret, the headmistress, greeted her with an approving nod. "We are blessed by your presence, Miss Whitmore. The children will adore you." Elara smiled gently. "If they find even a moment's joy in music, then I am the one blessed." The chapel's small piano sat in a corner by the window, sunlight glancing off its worn keys. When Elara's fingers touched them, the first notes of a hymn floated through the air, fragile, luminous. Children gathered at the doorway, eyes wide with awe, and in that moment, surrounded by innocence unmarred by gossip, she felt something like peace. Yet even peace carries the weight of memory. As she dismissed her new pupils and returned home, the letter lay heavy in her reticule. That evening, after much pacing and prayer, she drew a fresh sheet of paper from her desk and began to write. "Your Grace, it has come to my attention that an anonymous benefactor has provided for the music instruction at St. Brigid's. If it is you, as I suspect, allow me to express gratitude, not for generosity but for discernment. You have chosen to help those who cannot repay you, and that is a nobility no title can bestow. Yet I confess, I write with hesitation. My heart trembles between gratitude and fear. That kindness, once before, has been the prelude to humiliation. If this act was meant to redeem what has passed, I pray it is done for conscience, not pity. Respectfully, E. Whitmore." She paused, her quill hovering. The ink pooled slightly, forming the shape of a tear. For a long while she stared at the letter, the weight of decision pressing upon her. To send it meant vulnerability. To remain silent meant pride. Outside, the wind whispered through the eaves, a sound almost like rain. At last, she sealed the envelope and placed it upon the mantel, where the light of the fire caught its edges. "Tomorrow," she said softly. "If courage remains, I shall send it tomorrow." Across the city, at Ashbourne House, the Duke dismissed his steward and stood alone in his study. On his desk lay a single account, anonymously drafted, recording a charitable endowment to St. Brigid's. He ran a hand over it, smiling faintly. "Some gifts," he murmured, "must be made unseen to remain pure." The door creaked open and his valet appeared. "Your Grace, Lady Rosamond has called again." "Tell her," he said, his gaze fixed on the window beyond, "that I am not receiving visitors." "Yes, Your Grace." When the valet withdrew, silence filled the room. The Duke turned toward the rain-specked glass, where the city glowed faintly in twilight. Somewhere beyond those lamps, she was reading his unspoken apology. He closed his eyes, whispering into the dusk, "If she forgives me, it will not be for my words, but for what I dare to do next." That night, Elara's letter remained upon the mantel, the wax seal cooling under the quiet flame. And somewhere beyond the river, in the heart of London's fog, a duke's carriage rolled slowly past St. Brigid's Gate. Unseen, the bells of St. James's Cathedral tolled through the crisp London morning, their chimes trembling in the mist like silver threads. Carriages rolled one after another toward the grand entrance, wheels splashing through puddles left by dawn's passing rain. Inside, every pew was filled with the glittering expanse of the Tun. Dukes, marchionesses, ministers and courtiers, all gathered for a royal wedding that promised to be the highlight of the season. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, scattering jeweled hues across marble floors and gilded arches. White roses lined the aisle, their scent sweet and solemn. Beneath this spectacle of piety and power, Elara Whitmore sat quietly near the back, her gloved hands folded upon her lap. Her gown was modest, the soft blue of twilight silk, its hem embroidered with delicate white thread. Though unadorned, it carried an elegance born not of wealth but of calm dignity. She had been invited in recognition of her charitable work with St. Brigid's Orphan School, an honor she accepted only out of duty, not desire. It had been months since the Duke of Ashbourne's anonymous generosity had been revealed. Though they had exchanged no further correspondence, she knew, somehow, that his silence was not neglect, but restraint. Peace, though fragile, had begun to settle in her heart. Yet peace, she would soon learn, is the quiet before the next storm. From across the nave, whispers rippled like a hidden current. Heads turned subtly toward the procession of guests entering from the side aisle. The Duke of Ashbourne had arrived. Clad in black morning coat and silver waistcoat, his presence commanded attention without demanding it. His expression was composed, though his gaze, once it found Elara, wavered with an emotion that years of decorum could not conceal. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect she returned with equal restraint. Lady Rosamond Sinclair trailed at his side, radiant in rose silk and diamonds, her laughter ringing too brightly in the sacred space. "Observe her," whispered one dowager behind her fan. "She parades him as though the church were her stage." "And perhaps it is," another replied dryly. Elara turned her gaze forward, fixing it upon the golden altar where the royal couple would soon stand. Yet no amount of composure could steady the pulse that quickened in her wrist. When the service began, the air seemed to still. The choir's voices rose in ethereal harmony, echoing through the vaulted ceiling like prayer made sound. Elara allowed herself to close her eyes for a moment, to let the music soothe her unease, but tranquility lasted only until the moment the vows ended. As the royal couple recessed down the aisle and the guests began to murmur with release, Lady Rosamond rose abruptly, her fan snapping shut with theatrical precision. Her voice, honeyed and loud enough for all to hear, sliced through the reverent hush. "My lords, my ladies," she began with affected modesty, "since the spirit of love and fidelity fills this blessed day, I cannot but share news of my own forthcoming union with none other than His Grace, the Duke of Ashbourne." A collective gasp rose from the pews. Fans froze mid-wave. Every eye swung toward her, and then toward the Duke, who stood motionless, his face shadowed with disbelief. Elara's breath caught, her spine stiffening. Rosamond smiled coyly, lifting a lace-gloved hand toward him. "Your Grace, do not be shy. After all, London shall soon celebrate our vows as warmly as today's royal ones." Her words struck the air like a stone cast upon glass, each echo sharper than the last. Ashbourne's jaw tightened. For a moment silence hung, stretched taut between disbelief and scandal. Then he stepped forward, his voice ringing clear, every syllable measured and unyielding. "Lady Rosamond," he said, "I must correct a grievous falsehood before it grows into something irreparable." Her painted smile faltered. "Falsehood, Your Grace?" He turned, addressing the congregation. There is no engagement. There was never any intention of one. And I cannot, will not, permit my silence to lend credence to deceit. Whispers surged like a rising tide. Rosamond paled, her composure fracturing. You would humiliate me here before all of London? Ashbourne's tone softened only slightly. Truth, my lady, is not humiliation. It is deliverance, and then, before decorum could intervene, before society could breathe, he turned from her, crossed the marble aisle, and walked with purpose toward the rear pews, where Elara sat frozen in disbelief. The murmurs swelled to astonishment as he stopped before her. Miss Whitmore, he said, his voice low but resonant, forgive the intrusion, but I can no longer endure the falsehoods that bind me to a world without virtue. The crowd hushed. The very air seemed to tremble. He sank to one knee before her, gasps scattered like petals in a gust of wind. Even the royal couple paused near the doorway, turned to watch. I sought perfection, he said softly, so only those nearest could hear, but found grace instead. Elara's heart thundered. Her eyes filled with tears, not of joy, but of profound confusion. Your Grace, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Rise, this is neither the place nor the time. But he remained kneeling, sincerity laid bare before the merciless gaze of the Tun. Let them see what I see, he said, his voice rough with emotion. A woman whose dignity outshines jewels, whose kindness shames our pride. If this act ruins me, so be it. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft rustle of silk and the faraway toll of bells. Elara rose slowly. The pews around her blurred into abstraction, faces, fans, and gasps dissolving into a haze of color and sound. Her words came like the calm before a storm. Do not offer redemption in front of witnesses. Your Grace, offer truth in private. The ache in her voice silenced him more thoroughly than scorn ever could. She curtsied, the motion graceful, decisive, final. You owe me nothing but honesty, and I will accept that only when there is no audience to applaud it. Then, with quiet dignity, she turned and walked down the side aisle toward the open doors. Sunlight spilling around her like benediction, no one dared move. The orchestra, uncertain whether to play, faltered into silence. Ashbourne remained kneeling long after she had gone, the marble cold beneath his palm. Around him whispers swirled like restless ghosts. The Duke refused. The lady triumphant, the world reversed. Lady Rosamond, humiliated and trembling, swept from the cathedral, her sobs muffled by lace. At last the Duke rose. His mother, pale but composed, met his eyes from across the nave and inclined her head, not with reproach, but acknowledgment. He had chosen, whether wisely or not. Time would tell. Outside, the sky had cleared, the rain-washed streets glimmering under sunlight. Elara stood beneath the portico, the noise of the crowd fading behind her. The weight in her chest felt heavy but strangely liberating. For the first time, she understood that love untested by pride is no love at all. And somewhere behind her, in the echoing nave of St. James's, a man knelt no longer out of shame, but out of awakening. Morning light crept reluctantly across the Duke of Ashbourne's study, gilding the edges of half-read papers and the faint curl of smoke from an extinguished candle. The hour was late, or perhaps too early. He had not slept since the day at St. James's Cathedral. The echo of that moment, the weight of her refusal, the stillness of her curtsy, the quiet dignity of her departure, played endlessly in his mind. On the mahogany desk lay a single object of quiet torment, a letter, sealed in pale blue wax, its script unmistakably hers. The butler had brought it moments before, announcing with careful neutrality a dispatch from Miss Whitmore. Your Grace. Now it sat before him, fragile and terrible in its simplicity. The Duke hesitated before breaking the seal. The handwriting that unfurled across the page was fine, elegant, yet trembled in places, as though emotion had made the quill falter. Your Grace, I write not from pride, but from necessity. You have done me the honor of defending my name. Yet I cannot remain in a city where every kindness is weighed like currency and every heart is sold to the highest bidder. I'm leaving for Bath, where silence will not judge me and water may wash away what words cannot. I thank you for your sincerity at the cathedral, but I beg you to understand, freedom is all I ever sought, not a title bought by remorse. Whitmore. The Duke read it twice, then a third time. Her words were measured, but each carried the sting of finality. Freedom, she had written, not forgiveness, not affection, freedom. He pressed the letter to his lips, as if its ink could yield the sound of her voice. You would rather solitude, he whispered, than stand beside a man unworthy of you. For a long while he sat motionless. Then with a sudden resolve he rose. Have my horse saddled, he ordered, his tone low, decisive. We ride for Bath. The butler's eyes widened. At once, your grace? Before I lose the right to say what I should have spoken long ago. Night fell swiftly upon the road. Clouds gathered like shrouds over the moon, and wind tugged at the Duke's cloak as if to hold him back. His horse's hooves struck sparks from the cobblestones, echoing across the lonely miles. He rode without pause, his thoughts a storm of regret and clarity. At intervals the rain began, fine, persistent, cold. It soaked through wool and velvet alike, but he did not slow. With each mile, the ache in his chest deepened, not from exhaustion, but from the fear that he might reach Bath too late, that her decision, once made, was as immovable as her dignity. Freedom is all I ever sought, her words haunted him. He had spent years believing freedom lay in control, in mastery of the world and himself. Yet she, in her quiet defiance, had shown him that true liberty was born of truth, and truth required surrender. By the time dawn broke, the city of Bath lay before him, veiled in mist and pale gold light. He found her not in the town proper, but beyond it, by the Avon, where the river curved gently beneath a line of willow trees. She stood upon the bank, a solitary figure wrapped in a light grey shawl, her hair catching the morning sun in glints of copper and gold. For a moment, he did not move. The sight of her, serene yet shadowed by weariness, undid him more thoroughly than any words could. Elara turned at the sound of approaching hooves. Her expression was startled, then resigned. Your Grace, she said softly. London's gossip must travel faster than I, if it has sent you all this way. He dismounted, his boots sinking slightly in the damp earth. No gossip sent me, he replied. Only the truth of your letter. She drew her shawl closer, though the morning was not cold. Then you know my intentions. I wish no further entanglement with society, or its dukes. He stepped nearer, rain-darkened hair falling across his brow. And yet, he said quietly, it is not society that stands before you now. Elara's breath caught. There was no hauteur in his tone, no practiced charm, only weary sincerity. He went down upon one knee in the wet grass. Not forgiveness, he said, voice low, steady, but the chance to prove I am worthy. Her lips parted in disbelief. Your Grace, Marcus, he interrupted gently. If I have earned anything this far, let it be the right to speak as a man, not as a title. She stared down at him, heart warring between caution and compassion. The pale light caught upon his face, and she saw the truth there, the absence of pride, the presence of pain, and something rarer still, humility. You would do this, she whispered, knowing what the world will say. I would do this, he answered, because I can no longer bear to live as the world commands. The river moved quietly beside them, carrying away the last remnants of fog. A heron rose from the reeds, its wings slicing through the air like a benediction. Elara's eyes glistened. She wanted to reach for him, to believe in this transformation, but her fear still clung like frost. You have wealth, influence, reputation, she murmured. I have none. What you call worth may soon feel like burden. He looked up, rain beginning again in delicate threads. If devotion is burden, then let me carry it gladly. I do not ask for ease, I ask for truth, shared between equals. For a long moment neither spoke. The sound of the river filled the silence between them. Then Elara's expression softened. Slowly, she extended her hand. Rise, then, not as a duke seeking absolution, but as a man seeking grace." He took her hand. The warmth of her fingers in his felt like forgiveness, not yet spoken, but perhaps beginning. When he stood, she did not withdraw her hand. The world seemed to still around them, the rain, the wind, even the river pausing as though it too awaited her answer. At last she said quietly, "If you would have me, let it not be as your redemption, but as your reflection. For I am no longer the woman who trembled in ballrooms. I am the woman who learned to walk away." A faint smile touched his lips. "Then I am the man who learned to follow." The tension eased, not in finality, but in promise. She met his gaze fully, and for the first time there was no barrier of pride or pity between them, only understanding. Still, the world beyond the river would not forgive so easily. London awaited their return with sharpened tongues and eager eyes. Elara withdrew her hand gently. "Go back, Your Grace. The ton will need its explanations." "I will not be the ruin they accuse me of being." He bowed his head, rain glistening in his hair. "Then we shall face them together when you are ready." Her eyes softened, and for the first time she did not deny him. "Perhaps," she said, turning toward the water, "the world will learn that some stories end not in scandal, but in truth." He watched her as the morning light broke fully, golden across the rippling river. And though they stood apart, the distance between them no longer felt impossible. It felt like the breath before union. When she left for Bath that evening, he remained in the same spot by the river until twilight. The last of the day's sun bled over the horizon, and the first star flickered into being. He whispered to the fading light, "Then I shall earn her freedom by giving her my own." Rumour has a voice in London. It whispers through corridors lined with gilt mirrors, hums behind painted fans, and moves faster than the turning of a carriage wheel. In the days following Bath, its tone shifted once more. The Duke of Ashbourne had defied the ton, and not merely in silence, but in deed. He was seen in Covent Garden, speaking to parish men about donations for orphan schools. He refused invitations from titled families who had once courted his presence. He declined the Duchess of Monmouth's supper, an event no gentleman of standing had ever declined before. And when asked why, he answered simply, "I dine only with those who possess the courage to speak kindly of Miss Whitmore." The statement was repeated, embellished and retold until it reached every drawing-room in Mayfair. Some whispered that he had gone mad, others that he had fallen in love. But none could ignore the truth. The Duke of Ashbourne no longer bowed to the rules that had once defined him. Elara, meanwhile, lived quietly at her aunt's townhouse near Bloomsbury. The orphanage thrived under her guidance, and her music filled each morning with soft hymns that drifted through open windows into the London mist. She wished only to be left in peace, but peace, it seemed, had chosen not to leave her. One evening, a note arrived, simple, unadorned, sealed with no crest. "Miss Whitmore, the Marquis of Wexford's winter ball will be held tomorrow. I shall attend, and if you will permit, I wish to stand beside you, M. Ashbourne." Her fingers lingered over the signature. To appear beside him in public would be to court ruin or redemption. Perhaps both. She did not sleep that night. The following evening, snowflakes fell like whispered blessings upon the carriages lining Grosvenor Square. Wexford Hall gleamed, every window aflame with candlelight, every chandelier trembling with crystal brilliance. The sound of violins rose and fell like distant thunder. Elara stood in the entryway, the candlelight brushing the pale satin of her gown. It was not extravagant ivory with faint silver embroidery, but it shimmered with quiet grace. Her hair was arranged simply with a single pearl comb. She carried no jewels, for none could have rivaled the serenity in her eyes. Her aunt whispered nervously, "My dear, are you certain of this?" Elara managed a faint smile. "I have been certain of very little in this world, Aunt, but tonight I choose not to hide." As they entered, conversation faltered. Heads turned. Fans ceased fluttering. The crowd's astonishment deepened when, moments later, the Duke of Ashbourne stepped through the opposite doorway. He was dressed in black tailcoat and white cravat, his bearing as composed as if the whispers were nothing more than the rustling of silk. His gaze sought her instantly. When their eyes met, the murmur of the crowd receded into silence. He crossed the ballroom with measured calm. Every step felt like a declaration. "Miss Whitmore," he said when he reached her. His voice, though soft, carried easily across the polished floor. "Might I have the honor of this dance?" For an instant she hesitated, then curtsied. "You may, Your Grace." Gasps echoed like the intake of breath before a storm. The orchestra struck the first chords of a waltz. As he led her to the floor, the space around them widened, the other couples retreating. Unwilling or unable to intrude upon such scandalous spectacle, their hands met, gloved against gloved, and the world fell away. "Are you certain of this course?" Elara murmured as he guided her into the first turn. "You risk more than reputation tonight." He smiled faintly. "Reputation is a fragile crown, Miss Whitmore. You taught me that worth lies elsewhere." She exhaled a trembling breath. "You would defy them all for me?" "For truth," he corrected gently. "And for the woman who made me see it." Around them the music swelled. Candlelight shimmered across marble, across silk, across eyes that once judged, but now watched in uneasy awe. Midway through the dance, a nobleman, Lord Harbury, known for his cruel wit, leaned toward his companion and whispered too loudly, "A charitable endeavor indeed. The Duke rescues a damsel, if not her dowry." Laughter rippled, brittle and mean. The Duke stopped mid-step. Still holding Elara's hand, he turned toward the voice. His tone was calm, but it carried the weight of quiet thunder. "You mock virtue, my lord," he said evenly, "because it mirrors what you lack." The laughter died. Harbury flushed scarlet. I meant no offense." "Then let us assume none was taken," the Duke said with soft finality, and returned his gaze to Elara. "Shall we continue?" And they did. This time no one dared to whisper. The music shifted, slowing into a reverent rhythm. The air itself seemed to bow before them as they moved together, not in triumph but in peace. When the final notes faded, silence reigned for one long heartbeat. Then, as if drawn by something greater than etiquette, the assembled guests began to applaud. Not mockingly, but with hesitant sincerity that grew louder, warmer, truer. Elara's breath caught. Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes, not from pain, but from release. For the first time since that cruel night at Everleigh's ball, she smiled without trembling. The Duke bowed deeply. "Miss Whitmore," he said softly, "you have redeemed us both." Her gaze softened. "Then let us not waste such redemption in proving it to others." He offered his arm once more, and she took it, not as a supplicant, but as his equal. Together, they stepped away from the center of the floor, leaving behind the murmur of approval that replaced the whispers of mockery. Later, as the night waned, they stood upon the terrace, the cold air fragrant with snow and roses. The moon hung low, casting silver light upon the frost. Elara rested her hands upon the balustrade. "You have silenced them," she said quietly. "But at what cost?" He turned toward her. "At the cost of deceit. I shall not mourn it. You will face censure still," she said. "London forgives slowly. Then let it take its time," he replied. "My conscience no longer does." She looked up at him, her eyes luminous in the moonlight. "You have changed, Marcus." He shook his head. "No, Elara, I have only learned to see." A silence stretched between them, tender and full of possibility. The city beyond shimmered faintly in the distance, its glittering lights like 1,000 watching eyes, some hostile, some in awe, all irrelevant. He reached for her hand. "There remains one act still undone," he said quietly. "One truth yet unspoken." She turned to him, pulse quickening. "And what truth is that?" He smiled, a small, resolute smile. "That peace cannot live in secrecy. Tomorrow, before London, before all who doubted you, I will name you as the only woman I shall ever love." Her breath trembled. "Do not speak in vows lightly, Your Grace." "I speak in certainty," he said. "You gave me courage enough for nothing less." For a long moment she said nothing. The snow fell softly around them, veiling the world in quiet grace. At last she whispered, "Then let tomorrow decide what the world remembers, your scandal or your sincerity." He bowed his head. pressing her hand to his lips. "Whichever they choose," he murmured, "it will be truth." And as the first light of dawn began to colour the horizon beyond the terrace, the Duke of Ashbourne knew that their redemption, whispered tonight, would echo far beyond the walls of the ballroom. To be continued in Chapter 10, The True Duchess.